Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about a particularly vicious roguelike that's found its way into my Steam library, namely Mad Crown by Studio S Game. Come find out with me if this particular RPG experience manages to live up to its title and provide a crowning experience among roguelikes, or if it's more likely to drive you mad. So, plot is not Mad Crown's strongest point, due in part to the fact that the localization comes off as fairly janky and unfinished, but also rather pointedly being exacerbated by the fact that what bits of story they provided past the introduction were fairly lacking. The strongest segment is actually the introductory story segment, which at least lets you know that the titular crown is an artifact of the gods passed down through a line of prophets and has been recently lost with the disappearance of the 12th prophet. Civil war has broken out, and even recovering the crown likely won't be enough to stop it, but you've decided to recover it anyways, and that's all you really get as you're thrust into the game. At that point, the majority of the lore is provided vis-a-vis quirky and, in a number of cases, somewhat unlikable NPCs providing tidbits of dialogue in broken English. It doesn't help that these mistranslations also impact the game, vis-a-vis making it difficult to parse what consumables and equipments do at times. And actually having finished the game, I also can't exactly say that it came to a really satisfying plot resolution. We'll say it that way. That said, Mad Crown is actually a bit of an interesting monster in the gameplay department, since its tutorial actually manages to give a pretty good feel for the overall difficulty of the game. I say this because the pinnacle of my experience with the tutorial was a monster proceeded to friendly fire one of his friends, cannibalize him, level up a good 4 times, and then take a second turn right after that and one-shot his other buddy and cannibalize him, becoming a monstrous behemoth I probably couldn't hope to fight, but I tried, and then he cannibalized the third guy, gained more levels, and having realized that every attempt at killing this thing was missing it, I got to go, oh, well, this isn't good, especially when it one-shot my tank. And then I remembered that I had a fear potion, and I managed to get it to, run off, not kill everyone horribly, but that's Mad Crown at its most basic and forgiving. But how exactly does this beast work? Well, Mad Crown is a dungeon-crawling roguelike, which has you dividing your time between a hub area and exploring a set of randomized dungeons which become increasingly long and difficult. Rather than escalating in level over time, you get to enjoy starting each dungeon from level 1. Albeit with the gear you've managed to find over the course of your dungeon crawls, and with some passive abilities which you gradually acquire as you progress through the game, providing both stat boosts and also some useful abilities you can choose between, like trap detection or more treasure. That said, the game does have its risks, as while it forgoes permanently killing off party members, you instead lose all the gear you were carrying in that dungeon, unless you're fortunate enough to have a friend or acquaintance willing to use the dungeon code you provide to rescue you. It's less horrible than I expected, so there is that, but I actually never had a friend to go and share my dungeon codes with. And in fact, losing your gear isn't actually as bad as the game's upgrading and corrosion system. The reason for this is that there's both enemies and traps which decimate the stats of your items, and it can sometimes take hours to find the respective components to make one actually high level, but it takes a mere few moments to lose a level, or inversely several. In 5 hours, I actually managed to find 3 of the items to upgrade an item, and then in one fight, I had one thing literally chew through one of my pieces of armor and knock all its stats to 1. And this can make things fairly difficult given that the enemy encounters in and of themselves are tricky. Between things like the cannibal mosquitoes I talked about in the tutorial that ramp up to party-wiping demigods, enemies that toss out mind control, confusion, and stuns like they're going out of style, and just the myriad of traps scattered throughout the dungeons which cripple your characters and gear, there's just a very distinct and impressive feeling of, you're going to die, and there is nothing you can do about it if RNGesus doesn't smile on you. And this ends up becoming further complicated by the game's fel system. See, as you travel through the dungeon, your fel meter ramps up gradually. While it doesn't really harm you at first, once it maxes out, you begin to lose life with every step instead of recovering it, and the enemies rampage, becoming super fast, evasive murder machines. The only upside is if you manage not to die, they provide much better rewards and experience, and you do lose a little bit of fel every time you pick a fight and clear it. So, I mean, you're going to be in a lot of fights. Now, I will say I didn't mind the combat. Yes, it was fairly simple, given that most characters had 2 attack options and 1 defensive option and a passive ability, but the game does thankfully provide a fairly large amount of consumable items, which can provide some rather nifty tactical utility, and there is a fairly diverse cast that you can acquire to go and help you plunge deeper into the dungeon, which altogether helps a lot given that unless you have one of the resurrection items, a character that's knocked out isn't getting up until the end of the fight, so the choices you make end up feeling pretty clutch and meaningful at times. That said, if what you're seeing doesn't seem difficult enough for you, there's always the more expansive and the far more pure roguelike experience dungeons, which tend to be comparatively longer than the other dungeons you'd normally enter, bar you from bringing any gear into them, and also spit out gear that's not only unidentified so you don't know what you're picking up is terrible or not, it also spits out consumable items which do things like blind your entire party, mind control your party members. Have I mentioned, like, stun your entire party? They're lovely items. Things get hectic fast in that mode, though it's one of the most viable means of actually getting good gear to do the main story with, especially if you have the misfortune of wiping. Again. Now, as much as I have a lot of negatives to say about Mad Crown, I will say there's some genuinely likable elements in its sound design. Whether it's that super sweet opening intro, or just elements of its OST in general, I was actually pretty fond of what Mad Crown had to provide me on this front, though I would have liked more diversity in its tracks. Also, the graphics in this game are pleasing to look at. It's stylistically interesting, whether it's the still scenes that herald the end of every story segment and the intro slideshow, or the overall character and monster designs. There is a lot going for Mad Crown in the visual department, though you are going to end up seeing a number of enemy recolors as you progress further, though I haven't noticed that with the bosses as so far. So, when I think on the time I spent trying to dive into the depths of Mad Crown, I recognize that a lot of my time ended up being marked by frustration. The experience the game provided was not always an enjoyable one for me, and this is despite me enjoying other roguelikes such as Barony or Darkest Dungeon, and I believe part of that factor simply boiled down to how much I felt things were out of my hands at times. Dungeons riddled with a perverse amount of traps which permanently damaged your gear and you could not really see felt punishing, and not exactly in an enjoyable way. Advancing through the dungeon felt like a chore, and the lacking story, repetitive normal fights, and the peculiar sense that I wasn't really progressing at times, but actually getting worse, was not the most pleasant of experiences. Ultimately, I feel this game fumbled its potential, enough so that I wouldn't even consider it a fumble as per the rating system I use in this channel, but an outright fail. While at times the game felt like it had potential here, it ultimately just feels like it left early access too soon, and could have used more mechanical depth, a bit more tighter editing on its actual story and dialogue, and just a solid injection of fun. But yeah, that's all I really have to say on Mad Crown. If you agree or disagree with me, feel free to leave a comment down below, or just let me know whether or not you liked or disliked this video. If you do want to see more reviews or the developer interviews I do on this channel, feel free to hit the subscribe icon up there and the little bell icon, because that'll let you know when we're actually releasing something new. Other than that, though, this has been Arlyeon, and I hope you folks have a good time and that this video was informative and enjoyable. Anyways, I'll catch you folks next time.